Hello, I'm Gus Downing, publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the Loss Prevention News Network. We're here today with Denny Dansak, Senior Corporate Manager, ORC, the Kroger Company. Nelson Harrah, Director of ORC at the Gap Inc. Tony Sheppard, National Manager, Organized Retail Crime Unit, CVS Caremark. Debra Lussier, Senior Manager, Investigations at the Home Depot. And Scott Sanford, Director of Investigations and Training at Barnes & Noble Inc. In today's episode is to try to give you a national update of how the ORC problem is continuing to grow and what the views are of those leading the efforts to combat it. The NRF just released their ORC survey and found for the first time a definitive link between the online world and the brick-and-mortar stores. It also showed an increase in fencing operations, thieves returning stolen merchandise, and interestingly enough, it showed a decrease in ORC activity where ORC state laws are present. So let's turn it over to the group. Folks, let's start talking. Scott, you're first. About the online connection between brick and mortar and online stores, something you've been working on for years.
Yes, and I agree fully with the results of the ORC survey. There is definitely a nexus between the online world and brick and mortar. You think about it, online it's retail, and the payment fraud schemes that we see nowadays, definitely seen an increase in that type of activity, Gus, and that's impacting retailers at an alarming rate. We see it in our stores. The brick and mortar stores are actually putting more efforts into their online business, and you're starting to see the customers overflow into the stores as well. So I would definitely say there's an increase there.
So does that match kind of like the increase in e-commerce business? I mean, is that the nexus there, the parallel, so to speak?
Well, from an ORC perspective, I would say that individuals engaged in payment fraud schemes, that should fall under the ORC umbrella. In fact, in our organization, we consider that to be organized retail crime because of the activities that they're doing is very organized, and it's costing us losses as well.
Debra, your thoughts on that?
I think we definitely are seeing an increase in the online marketplace with the brick and mortar places, and I think another contributing factor, just as we look at the supply and demand, right? That's why our fences exist, because there's a demand and the boosters selling into the fences. But I think the same way, now that our economy and our consumer base, we push them omni-channel. So there's a comfort level to shop online now. Where 5 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, you're online and you saw product, new unboxed product, there was less of a chance to maybe appetite to purchase, where today it's normal. So there's also a demand and a supply online for a unskilled customer to actually make those purchases, which enhances the demand for the brick and mortar to use it. Gives them a broader scope to sell their product.
Tony, do you see it at CVS?
Well, I think a lot of it obviously depends on the product that you carry. I mean, with our product, especially from a boosted standpoint, our product, some of it certainly is sold online, obviously at different venues. But what we've seen is that typically the online sites are really just a connection point between that booster or that lower level fence and the higher level fence. And once they make that connection, whichever site they happen to be using, because they're selling in bulk, they then take those transactions now offline. So it's really just a connection point because, a couple of reasons. Obviously, it takes away the track of that activity, right? So there's no record of it happening. But in addition to that, a lot of the sites obviously charge commissions to sell on their site. So if they're selling in bulk, they already have a buyer. Why do they need to continue to use the site to process the transactions when now they can interact with each other, they've got the automatic connection, they no longer need to use the site. So in our cases, it's more of a connection point between lower level and higher level, or the boosters themselves that are taking it, and then that's the connection to the fence.
Mm-hmm. Nelson, what about the apparel side of the house? How does that, connect there?
Yeah, Gus, speaking for Gap Inc., I'd say the biggest outlet for us from our boosted stolen merchandise from an ORC standpoint ends up more at flea markets, ends up in traditional fencing operations, whether it's a private residence or a mom and pop shop. Mm-hmm. Flea markets, we're doing a lot more work in the last year and we'll continue focusing on flea markets, especially in Southern California.
Mm-hmm. What about the studies finding about the increase in fencing operations? I mean, are we getting better as an industry in investigating it? Or is there a real increase, and why? Denny?
From our investigations, we see an increase because of the mere fact they're making a lot of money at it. Mm-hmm. And we're also seeing an increase because we are able to differentiate ORC from your normal shoplifting. Mm-hmm. I think for the 4.5 years that I've been with Kroger, everybody is more aware of ORC. And when you're more aware of it, it's going to cause an influx in what you see, mm-hmm. and you can differentiate this. So I agree that there's an increase, but also we're doing a better job identifying it. Mm-hmm. Those cases come into the court systems, increases the statistics.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the online world has helped increase the fencing operations, so to speak? Deborah?
I think it certainly creates just one more venue, for people to exploit and utilize to their own benefit. And then I think for the brick and mortar places, it gives them a diversion. Mm-hmm. So, it just makes it that much harder to truly understand. You see the boosters going in the front door, the brick and mortar, but then when you do an audit or law enforcement engages and then the product's not there. So it just creates a roadblock. Mm-hmm. To make the investigation a little more difficult to find out where did it go. And on the flip side, it does help from a law enforcement point of view because it creates a more opportunity for criminal enterprise and different laws, that perhaps we can leverage mm-hmm. against the fact that they're doing that.
Denny, you just made a comment about differentiating between the shoplifting and the ORC. I mean, how do you do that? I mean,
we look at what product was stolen in the amount of the same product that was mm-hmm. stolen. If you have that, we would look at that and consider that organized retail crime, mm-hmm. as opposed to the 18, 19-year-old girl going into the store and stealing a couple eyeliners and maybe a tube of lipstick.
Sure.
So we look at what they steal, not necessarily by the amount that they steal mm-hmm. in price. Mm-hmm. We look at the same items that they're trying to get out the store. Mm-hmm. And if it's a lot of the same items, it's organized retail crime. Mm-hmm. That's what we consider it. And we know it's a narcotics-driven crime. Mm-hmm. So we take that all into consideration. We look at the prior criminal history of the person stealing it. Mm-hmm. If there's narcotics convictions, there's a good chance it's going to be organized retail crime to sell the product for narcotics.
Mm-hmm. Scott, what about you on that?
In regards to the fences,
sure.
The online community has definitely driven that business. We've seen over the years that people that typically do not steal in bulk and sell at the flea markets have felt much more comfortable selling online because of the sense of anonymity there. Mm-hmm. And it's really brought forward a new class of shoplifter in our minds. And I think with retailers getting savvy to what eBay's been able to do and Amazon, you'll see more online marketplaces, mm-hmm. and therefore there's going to be more venues for people to steal and sell product. Mm-hmm. In doing so under the cloak of anonymity.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about the orcas across the country. Our last count has them at over 30 around the United States. I mean, how is that helping, and does anyone see a national effort in the future? Nelson?
Yeah, it's significant, and we've seen probably in the last 3 years. And I mean, this really started originally with the Harrah out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. That was the model, mm-hmm. and then came soon after La Orca, and as recent as this last couple of weeks, now we have New York City achieving their first, establishing their first orca, Alaska. And one of the areas we're most proud of is Cal Orca. So we took the 5 or 6 orcas that were originally in California And they've worked hard amongst the different law enforcement agencies that manage those 5, 6 ORCAs, combine them into CalORCA. And that's significant because on a major boosting team that operates throughout the entire state of California, we would have to go in and put in 6 different submissions on that ABOLO for that particular crew. Now it goes into one repository and it can go out and disseminate. I think the key there is what they've done in California, we now need to regionalize throughout the rest of the United States. So hopefully that serves as a model, Gus, that as we go into New England, as we go into some of those other markets, we need to make sure they have that similar format. And if we could ever unify, put that into one major database someday, that's where we need to get.
Well, that would be powerful.
That would be absolutely powerful.
Your thoughts, Tony, on that?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of, obviously the ORCAs themselves, but there's a lot of national groups, right? And there's several different ones. And the problem is that, from when you're inputting data, for example, now you're having to put it in multiple different systems, right? So to Nelson's point, I mean, the ORCAs are great. We certainly need some sort of national ORCA. What I would like to see, and I think this might be what Nelson's leading to, is that so they took and combined the different ones in California and make it a Cal type ORCA. I would like it to where if I have an investigator in California who inputs something into the Cal ORCA, he could, if he knows it's a national group, then it would automatically be linked to this national ORCA database. So you've got all the different state ones, but then that way it makes it from a processing standpoint. If you put it in one, it's automatically like flows into a national type database because, again, it's great for the state of California, but if you have boosters, again, who are traveling from California to Chicago and to New York, you're not going to get that connection. So if you had a national database, somebody puts in, they got a plate in California or New York, now they know that crew obviously is also targeting Chicago, and they're also, so I think that just from a labor standpoint, I think it would be easier, but I still think you need to keep the ownership of the ORCAs within those groups, right? Because they've worked hard to do that. And you also don't want to make it just national because then it's overflowed with information. You should have the flexibility to see it in that state, but then also have it linked nationally so that way if you have a national group or a crew that's out or whatever, that it flows better. So.
Deborah, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think the ORCAs, we've heard a lot already about the information sharing, the data intelligence, to leverage that, but I think the ORCAs have a lot to bring locally as well as far as partnerships, right? It's an area or an opportunity for local the retail loss prevention specialist on ORC along with law enforcement in those communities to come together. And I think a lot of where we've benefited from the ORCA is just training, right? What is ORC? What does it look like from our different retail establishments? Because it's a little different, but the end game is still the same as far as they're going to offense. But it gives law enforcement also the ability to work both teams together and work with the local prosecutors or state to determine what laws can we leverage, right? What works instead of trying to repeat that over and over and leverage that information. So I think the ORCAs have a lot to bring beyond the data information sharing, but also just education, training, as more law enforcement people come in and, new faces come to those organizations, it's keeping that training going.
What advice would you have for an LP executive or even a law enforcement partner that possibly is in a locale that doesn't have an ORCA? I mean, how do they get it started? Who should they contact, and how do they get it going? Denny?
This is where the partnerships come in. Partnerships not only between retail and law enforcement, but law enforcement to law enforcement. We see that now in the Sacramento area where we haven't had ORC cases before. And you're starting to see law enforcement talking to other jurisdictions, which years ago really didn't happen. Everybody says it happened. You would like to think it happened, but it really didn't happen. And I think with these groups traveling, I think law enforcement is talking more, and I think that is a domino theory that other law enforcement agencies get involved. Other law enforcement agencies get involved, the retailers get involved. So I do think it's a domino theory. If you have one, I think it expands by itself.
Well, it has been rather rapidly over the last couple of years alone. So another point of the survey talks about the impact state ORC laws are having on ORC activity. With 24 states having those laws, are you seeing that, and how do we get more states to pass ORC laws? And just as important, what are your predictions about a federal law? Deborah?
Well, certainly the state laws are extremely beneficial because it's just the nature of these types of groups. They do go cross-jurisdictional. They don't stay in a single store. That's the whole nature of these folks. They hit multiple stores, multiple days, travel, Monday through Friday, and therefore it makes the state law very, very beneficial. So that, as Nelson explained, you don't have to go to all the different local agencies to try to file a significant case on these folks. So by far, huge benefit. Prediction on federal, at least a lot of the cases we see, they do keep going, which means they do cross state boundaries. So it is very, very difficult once that happens, because then it does raise it to more of a federal level case, and it would be wonderful to have take that same vision from a state perspective to the federal.
Scott, any comments there?
I'd have to echo Deborah's thoughts on that, but I think the workaround has been for many retailers when they deal with a multi-jurisdictional cases, utilization of your federal partners. And they've been successful utilizing the Title 18 offense, interstate transportation of stolen goods is often what we see them prosecuted under. And we've been successful. I can't speak for the others here at the table, but it's gone to the point where most cases that we handle nowadays at Barnes & Noble are addressed through federal authorities because of that. We have had some challenges with certain areas accepting our cases. And of course, what we do at Barnes & Noble is slightly different than some other retailers, but I think that if we're ever to get to that point where there's federal legislation, that could only be a big plus for retailers.
Yeah, I guess I think that, that obviously the state laws are great, but unfortunately, as everybody said, these people cross state lines, right? So unfortunately, you can have an individual, say a booster, who literally might have a warrant out in 5 different states. I actually have a perfect example at NRF, this conference a few years ago when it was in New Orleans. I happened to run into a national booster, literally just happened to see him, and so I started calling to find out about, and he had warrants in several different states, but it took me until the next morning, and he fortunately had 1 warrant that was extraditable only because he pushed an employee on the way out, which made it classified as a robbery. So I was able to have him arrested, and Florida came and picked him up, but it was only because it was a robbery. So if he hadn't pushed that employee, he's out boosting in Louisiana, and he's got warrants in 5 different states. He's just not going to go to those particular states anymore. There's got to be a connection. And also to Scott's point, we've had a lot of success as well with federal cases, but every office is different. You're starting over. So if you have a case in Miami, you've never dealt with a federal agency in Miami, you have to start. So I think that if there was federal legislation, obviously it would put a little bit more oomph behind it, and these agencies would be more apt to be involved. So, and I actually am optimistic that at some point there will be legislation. There was actually a bill passed through the House back in 2010 to create a federal task force, and unfortunately didn't make it into the Senate. But I'm cautiously optimistic that at some point there will be federal ORC legislation.
Denny?
I totally agree with what everybody said here, and I'll go one step further. Is we're having more and more cases where money is wire transferred outside the United States. Once you hit that, and I'm talking over $500,000 every month for a 13-month period is wire transferred out of the United States. That in and by itself is very problematic for local law enforcement. We're seeing more and more cases worked with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the JTTFs across the United States. Even though they work them, they're working them as AML cases, but still, if they're worked on a local level, there's really not a crime that would fit that. So federal legislation is a must for us. And federal law enforcement wants to get involved. And are the U.S. attorneys saying, yeah, I will prosecute that? So right now, it's in limbo. You have, the FBI, you have DHS wanting these cases, and where do they go? Because there's no federal law. Like Scott said, you can interject other crimes, but if it's not interstate transportation and it's wire transferred outside the United States, it's very problematic. So we definitely need federal legislation to address that.
Well, how do we bring all this information from all the retailers around the country that we can differentiate that is ORC and put it all together and be able to take it to the Hill and say, here's our problem, help us solve it. I mean, the retail industry has been primarily individualized, territorial, you know, so how do we do that?
Gus, we've actually been doing that. I mean, the NRF Legislative Committee actually has worked diligently. You know, we go up there at least once a year. We've met with several different committees, the Judiciary Committee, Homeland Security, many individual, you know, congressmen and women, senators, et cetera. But, you know, unfortunately, you know, the government, there's always many things happening, right? So what's happened in the past, just like it did in 2010, is that you're making progress, you're making traction, and then unfortunately, you know, something else comes about, right? So right now, obviously, data security is the big push button, right? So unfortunately, when other things happen, that's all the attention goes towards that. So it's very frustrating, I can tell you that. But again, I think that we have done that. I mean, there's several retailers that go on those trips and meet with these folks and combine information and have, you know, statistics and examples that they can share with them of why we need this type of legislation. But again, there's always, you know, government always has priorities, and sometimes other things trump that item. So.
And if I could add on
Please.
to that, and everybody absolutely, you know, I concur with everything my peers are talking about, suggesting is also thinking about the other nexuses to it. So human trafficking, the violent, you know, so the last time I was on Capitol Hill, I was bringing 3 or 4 examples of, it's not about necessarily the shrink for Gap Inc., but it's the environmental effect to somebody terrorizing our stores, threatening our stores, et cetera, using violence, terroristic tactics, et cetera. So it's also making sure they see the bigger picture, not just our shrink. Because they look at the Gap, big company, we can accept losses.
Right.
There's much more to our community and the impact to our customers and our employees that's more important than our shrink.
Well, I want to thank all of you for participating and spending some time with us during the show.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Well, that concludes this episode on ORC. We'd like to thank the members of the Roundtable and thank you for listening. We hope you gain some knowledge and information that helps you deliver best-in-class loss prevention services. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. You delivering best-in-class service to your retailer. Thanks for listening.